Okay. So the thing with hubs is that it's, essentially a super easy way to upload, but you have to follow a few steps to do this. So
What's a hubs?
Oh, sorry. When I say hubs, I refer to Mozilla Hubs. So that's what we looked
Oh,
at.
sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it
Oh,
now.
yeah. And always, even if I'm like screen sharing and I don't see you, just shout out, because that way I can always hear you even if I don't see what you're doing. So, all right. So let me share my screen so you can see what I'm doing here. All right. So here I have a little geometry that I made for a competition project a while ago, and it actually has texture maps on it. But because for some reason V-Ray is not working at the moment on my laptop, you can't see them, but they're actually sort of red texture maps that had like a handwritten text on them, and each of these kind of shapes had one of these maps on them, and there's kind of a little balloon. It doesn't really matter. It's just for you guys to see the process. So what you do when you have your little pavilion, you take it. And so there's basically, two ways to do it. The easy way, when you just want to kind of test it first, you can just go ahead and then export it as an OBJ. And then when you export it as an OBJ, it gives you different options in terms of like, so I'm going to put it here, test. So you're probably familiar with that dialog where it asks you if you want it to be a Nurbs object or a polygon mesh. You definitely want it to be a polygon mesh, because basically the way that computer graphics work is on the web and in games and anything that's real time, anything that you kind of look at, almost anything outside of Rhino. Rhino is really kind of like a unique, not unique, but like a case of Nurbs geometry. And sorry, I'm just curious, how many of you, like, do you guys know what Nurbs are versus meshes? Does anybody have like a working definition of that difference? Not really. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll get into that into a second, because that's a really important distinction. But anyway, when you export it as an OBJ, you get this window, polygon mesh options. And there's kind of like a default that's kind of like a middle amount of kind of an average amount of density of polygons. So let's say you press OK. Because this is quite a lot of geometry, it will just automatically mesh these shapes. So what does that mean? A mesh geometry is essentially a geometry object that, sorry, if you see a black square, this is my zoom screen over it. A mesh geometry originally was invented to kind of like represent the world with like the minimum amount of data, and that's why it's actually still used for games and for all these environments. So basically, you kind of have a low resolution representation of the world, but then if with various smoothing algorithms and stuff, it can look very realistic. So a Nurbs actually, and I have a full lecture, I have a 1 hour lecture I have about this. I'm going to post it in if you're kind of like interested in that kind of stuff, you should watch it. A Nurbs was invented originally, literally Nurbs were, splines, which is like a type of Nurbs, are the kind of wooden rulers that were bendy and that you could bend into any shapes, and they were used to draw ships and airplanes, specifically ships actually. So basically Nurbs is kind of like a mathematical description of how to create a perfectly smooth curve out from the mathematical description of that spline, of that piece of wood. And if you think of a piece of wood that has like a certain tension in it, it becomes smooth by basically describing, you only need like a few points, right? The way that, so I didn't think I would get into this right now, but like it's important, so I'm going to just show it. So when you draw a smooth curve in Rhino, you actually just draw a few points, and then the control points are the ones with which you actually change the curvature. So I can take the point now and move it, and the curvature is going to change, right? So if you have a spline, if Google is gonna, yeah, so here you see, so okay, here's an example, right, of a literally a physical spline. You see it here. So this is the wooden stick I was talking about. And so here it can be even very thin. And you have these things, so the physical equivalent here, so here you see a large one, right? Like this is like really cool. It's like you have to really draw a full-size ship, they had to make really, really big ones. Oops, sorry, there you go. In order to make any smooth curvature, they had to basically define it with these things that they call them ducts. But the current equivalent of a duct virtually is the control point. So, and you have different kinds of splines now, right? You have the ones where the control point is actually literally on the line, or you have the ones like this one, where actually the control point is on the line itself. And then you have the one like this one where you drew it, and then it kind of created an interpolation between the different between the different points. But anyway, those are just different mathematical definitions, but they're all kind of the same idea. So when
do the ducts have springs in them, so you can like some can be pulling harder on the piece of wood in tension than others?
I don't think they have springs. I think it's just a weight, and if you pull it further away, it will create a larger, like a steeper curve. Cool. So that's when computers became more in a way sophisticated, right? Because then with curves, you can change the degree of a curve. You have one first degree, second, third degree curves, and that changes of the way that the interpolation of that curve works. So it's not literally, it's not. It kind of was like the original way that this kind of geometries got translated. It's kind of like the history of it. But today, of course, on a computer, you have like many different variations of that kind of spline and nerve. But the important thing about splines today is because they're actually defined by these by the mathematical description of the interpolation between these points, you can zoom in infinitely and it will always be a smooth curve. So it's kind of like that, and you see how even now like the image behind is already all blurry, the pixel, but like it's like endless zooming and it's always going to be smooth. With polygons, it's different. So it's kind of very similar to Illustrator versus Photoshop. It's like a 2D version of that, like right in, you're familiar with vectors versus pixels. So with vectors, you can zoom in infinitely, and it's the same thing with Nurbs. And that's why we like using Rhino, because it actually is very precise, and it allows us to it allows us very easily to create very precise vector output and vector drawings that are then also, it kind of translates to AutoCAD, which is also a software in which you can zoom in infinitely in and out because it's all vectors. So you can think of like vectors and splines and Nurbs as sort of inhabiting one world, and then pixels and polygons and meshes to inhabiting another world. And the world of the meshes is not infinitely scalable. The same way that when you zoom into an image, you start seeing pixels at some point, and you zoom into a mesh object. And I think that the balloon I have here is a mesh object. So let's take that as an example. Or is it actually? Maybe it's a Nurb, I'm not sure. Okay, here, this is a mesh object, right? So it appears smooth from far away, but when you zoom in, you already start seeing the polygon edges here. So it kind of like looks jagged. And so the reason is because these, the polygons were always just used as kind of an approximation, again, with minimum data of reality. And so, you guys know the low poly aesthetic, right? You've seen sort of, you know what I'm talking about? Say no, you seem kind of like not sure. Okay, I'm going to show you an example. Low poly example. So, this kind of shoe, you see it? So that's literally a low polygon shoe, right? Like somebody, so this is like a mesh. It's essentially turning the aesthetic of a mesh that's almost like a mistake or by accident. It was not actually meant to be used that way, but basically some designer was like, oh, actually this like low polygon, right? Low polygon version actually looks kind of cool, and they made it into a design. But it's actually just sort of like a rough approximation of how of how to describe a shape that usually works in conjunction with a smoothing algorithm that actually smooths over it, where it appears smooth enough when you're using it in, for example, a computer game or in a web interface. Again, there's a full-length lecture on that, and I'll post it and I do recommend watching it, especially if you're not familiar with these things, just because they'll help you to understand. So right now, the default geometry that we're creating in Rhino is Nurbs. So I'm gonna just make a copy of this object right now, and just show you a little bit like what happens when you turn it into a mesh object. So when you have a default setting of exporting something as a mesh, and I think there's some double surfaces in here. Okay, let me just pull this one surface out. This was originally a render model, so it had all these different layers on it. But okay, so now it's a mesh object. Sorry, it's a Nurbs object, but you can turn it into a mesh in Rhino just simply by hitting mesh. And so we get that same dialog that we got with the when we exported it as an OBJ. It's the exact same thing. So what you can do now is hit the preview button, and you see how the surface is getting populated with a pattern. And this is basically the computer trying to approximate how a mesh, kind of optimized mesh would look like, or how a mesh version of that object would look like. So this is sort of like the average kind of setting that, that's what the computer estimates is like still good enough and has a small enough file size, but isn't basically not too detailed. And you see when you start zooming in, you see how you start seeing these kind of sharp edges. But if you know they're going to be looking at this object only from far away, that's totally fine. It's not a problem. But if you really want to save data, if you want to have a smaller file size, you can go to fewer polygons, and you see now it's like a much more coarse mesh. Basically, it's like way smaller file size, but then you'll get like a pretty jagged mesh. And if you go into more polygons, you start being much finer. So I'm going to just hit OK. But what's kind of important is at first, if you can turn, so now you have the original surface, Nurbs surface, still in there, and you press mesh, and now you have both surfaces next to each other, actually on top of each other. So when I kind of hover over the object, I can choose if I want to select the surface or the mesh, and they kind of look identical. If I would go into render mode, oh, I hope that doesn't crash it. I actually don't see a difference at the moment, right? Because also I used the kind of high resolution mesh. So I'm going to move it out here, so you see that they actually look exactly the same right now. So that's sometimes confusing to people because, now there are like two different geometrical types with very different purposes. This is the mesh and this is the Nurb, even though they look the same. But if I do the same thing with this one now and do it on the lowest setting, you'll start seeing that it's a little bit more jagged, and you'll actually see a difference between the two. So here I'm selecting the mesh and I'm pulling it out here. And you start seeing the sharp corners here. So that's because this mesh is kind of like too optimized, at least for looking at it that way. Okay, all of this is to say that when you have your geometry, it depends on the complexity and size of your model, but you need to go through that step of actually turning it into a mesh. And instead of just accepting the default setting at the export, I would recommend actually doing it manually like this, where you kind of preview the mesh and decide what a good resolution is, or what a good kind of quality of mesh size is for you. All of that becomes important because the overall file size of our model shouldn't be too big. So there's a limit of overall. So the recommended limit by Mozilla Hubs is 20,000 polygons, which is not much at all. It sounds like a lot, but actually you hit it very quickly, right? Even this small object already has like 100 polygons or something. I've actually uploaded models that are way heavier than 20,000. So, you can experiment with that. The main reason they recommend 20,000 is that with 20,000 polygons, it will work on any device. So if somebody opens it up on their phone, because you can open it on your phone or on a tablet or something like that, on even not a great internet connection, it'll still work. But since we're all we're using awesome laptops on pretty good internet connections, I think we can pretty safely go up. But just keep in mind that you just want to be aware of like the polygon count final count when you upload stuff. All right, so let's look at the original file that we exported just with default settings.
Vika, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you export as an OBJ, is Rhino doing the same thing as the mesh command?
Yes, it's doing the exact same thing.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. You just, basically, unless you can, even when you export it, I'm gonna actually just export these ones again.
So you can export Nurbs polygons because then the export is going to turn them into a polygon mesh.
Yeah, so here I'm gonna say second test, and then you can also, so here you can choose Nurbs objects, but that will be useless for you. You can't take that into Mozilla Hubs. So you definitely want to have the polygon mesh option selected.
Okay.
And I don't know, those settings, they should be fine by default. I didn't mess with them. So yeah, that's the only one that you have to, I think it's also by default, OBJ by default exports as polygon, so it should be fine. But you can also, so this is the exact same dialog as when I hit mesh. And also here you can hit preview. So let's do a little lower setting and say preview. And then you can, but I don't recommend doing that because you see what happens. It's going to be really heavy. So first take, okay, it's not too bad. But now what I did on that one service, doing it on a whole model, and I'm previewing the whole thing. Actually, let me do one thing. I'm going to turn off these pipes here, just so that our model is a little lighter, so we don't have to.
Is there anything we should be aware of, like when we're turning it into an OBJ, that like we should be aware of in our model? I don't know, like closed and open and all that kind of stuff. Is there anything that would cause a large problem that we can, avoid?
I will not say no because probably there's tons of stuff, but and I guess once we look at your models, maybe we can get more specific. And yes, I'm definitely ready to do some tech support this week with you if you have issues. I would say that closed versus open is not a problem. So if you have open surfaces, that's totally fine. Yeah. So if you have generally, I think one thing to be aware of is curvature. So as soon as you have lots of curvature in your model, you just want to make sure, kind of like what I did now, that the resolution isn't too low. But again, too high will make your file too heavy. So it's a bit of a balance. It's usually like takes, I've done it a million times, and I still usually kind of take a few attempts. I mean, to be honest, as a lazy person, I do often just use a default setting in the beginning and see what comes out, what kind of file size I get. And then when, then I optimize from there, or I see what I can do to reduce the file size. Okay, so the next, but again, I'm sure there's like tons of exceptions and stuff that come up with, people's geometries. So the next step of this journey is that you open up Blender. Do you guys have Blender installed on your computers? Maybe not. Yes, I don't know. You should check it.
I don't know. Yeah.
Blender is free. It's actually awesome because it's like a open source software. So 3D Max is actually also free for students, but then they charge a lot of money. But Blender is actually a kind of collectively developed open source software. So if you want to learn a software that you always want to be sure that you can use it in the future for your own purposes, even if you can even use it professionally and not have to pay for it. I actually am not a Blender expert, just full disclosure. I was, but for this purpose, we don't really need to know how to use it. We just need to import and export something. So when you have Blender open, and if you have problems installing Blender or whatever, just let me know. Do you guys all have Yale computers or your own?
I'm working on my own computer.
I'm working on my own, but I could be on the Yale one.
Okay. If you have your own computer, it should not be a problem at all to install it, because it's just, I know that some schools have administrative things where you can't install another software, like they just kind of block you from it. So if anybody has issues with that, let me know and we can make sure it gets imported. Anyway, so you go File, you go Import, and then here you have a list of formats, and you just hit OBJ, and then you navigate to your folder. In my case, it's demo, and I'm gonna. So see, I exported 2 files. One was test, and the other one was test2. So just from sliding that, moving that slider to a little bit more low resolution, the second file was much smaller. It was like a quarter or like a third of the original file. So, you know, I'm going to import the smaller one now in here, and it looks like it's taking a second to load. Oh no, here it is. Sorry. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. So that's not a good example, but you should actually try to always export your model from, even in Rhino, just to avoid this kind of problem. Just move it to 0, 0, 0. It's just going to be easier, because like if you you know, just grab it on somewhere on the ground level and move it to 0, 0, just because otherwise exactly the same thing might happen to you, where you actually have imported it, but you just don't see it because it's slightly off. And here it wasn't too far off the center, but it'll be, it could create all kinds of problems, especially if you're very far from the center. Okay, so here I have my model. And I want to say that in this case, because I have that very problem right now, it didn't translate the materials. But if you work with texture maps and you have texture maps in your Rhino, like normal Rhino texture maps, it will also import them automatically into Blender and then bring them into Mozilla Hubs. And you'll see that the model that I did on my other computer where Vera is working has all the texture maps on them. Okay, so you know, it's imported. You don't have to do anything with it. You just go export, and then you go to GLTF. It's a weird file format. I've never really used it much before, but it's essentially a web file format. And yeah, it's just the one that we have to use. Don't try not to question it too much. So here I go into demo, and here I say and just the default settings should be fine. So you say export, and should be there now. Oh, I'm still thinking. Okay. So we have our file now. We're now ready to go. So we just did some meshing, first up meshing, then export OBJ, import into Blender, export as G. So actually the ending of that file is GLB. And also I'll write that into the, yeah, it's already actually in the Slack. So don't worry if you forgot that right now. So actually now we're ready to go into Spoke. So Spoke, this is, you all saw Mozilla Hubs last time, but Spoke is basically the editor. It's kind of like your Rhino, in which you're creating your actual room and you're creating your actual environment. So here we have, you know, here's one scene that I did where I actually use that same model. And just create a new project. And when you create new projects, you can actually you can use any of these kind of funny existing scenes. And that actually is important because I think we'll basically have to, you know, once we have our site, we have to upload the site as well, just so we can then place your individual meeting rooms onto the site. So so basically, one group will upload the actual site, and all the same things I just said, you know, obviously apply to that as well. It has to be like, you have to be really mindful of the files and so on. But in this case, I'll just, you know, maybe I'll just go with the wide open space, just to kind of have like a flat neutral background. And then it looks very much like any other editor, any other 3D software that you might be learning. So you have kind of like environment, you can rotate with using the left mouse button. And then you have, you know, a few sort of like basic, like move, rotate, and scale buttons and stuff like that. And you have a menu down here where you have elements. So this is sort of like different kind of default elements that are kind of given. and then you have my assets. And so in my assets, so stuff that I've already uploaded for other projects, it kind of appears here. But you don't need to worry too much about it. So you can actually just take your model that you exported and just drop it straight into the screen.
Could you send us the link right now?
The link.
Is it a hub Mozilla, whatever this stuff is, right?
Oh, so this one is called Spoke.
Spoke.
So I can send you the link.
What's it called on Google? Spoke Hub or what?
Spoke Mozilla, and then here Spoke by Mozilla. So you need to log in and just make an account.
Oh shit! Make an account. Oh, all right.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, it should be quick. It's just like a. Here, I put it into our Slack. Create 3D social scene for hubs. Okay, so now I have my current scene that I made, right? So this is the one I just exported, which didn't have textures on it, but I'm also gonna import the one that bring in the one that I imported the other day that actually has the proper textures. The process is exactly the same, so the texture should get picked up automatically. If you have issues with textures with your own model, just let me know. Okay, so here's my original model, and you see it's kind of really like a normal editor. I can move things around. Oh, you see the scale difference. That's actually a really important point that I should mention. For some reason, I don't know if Europeans designed it, but your model needs to be in meters to be in real scale. So before you export your model from Rhino, that's really the moment to do it. Just scale, like, you know how to change scale. Like you just go unit and yeah. So here, and you go from inches to meters. That's why at the moment, this model was a lot smaller. So just say yes. And you know, then it'll be in a real scale.
Also, you want meters as the unit?
What?
When you export, you want the meter as a unit, right?
Not that I want. I mean, I think we're gonna be working in inches in a semester because the project is in the US. Just saying that Mozilla, the default scale, if you just import stuff and if you want it to be in the right scale without having to scale it, you can also scale it in here. It's just easier to do it in Rhino than to do it afterwards in Spoke.
Right. So the system only reads meter, right?
Yeah, exactly. It reads meters as 1-to-1.
Thank you.
Okay, so here I have my scene. I did the exact same thing, but I had the textures, you know, before in Rhino, so you can see that I can actually import textures and have my little environment. So now there's a few different things I can do in here to kind of you know, modify the scene. So one thing is the spawn points. So what is a spawn point? Remember when we came in and basically just landed in the world somewhere? We kind of just emerged into a certain point. So that's a spawn point. That's basically where a person that enters the room is going to appear there. It's important because that's basically the first encounter with the space. And in this scene, for some reason, the default was actually 4 spawn points, but I actually just want 1. So I'm going to delete the other spawn points. So you can see how on the right side, basically it's called hierarchy. It's basically all the things that are in your scene are going to be in that within that hierarchy. So here I still have 1 spawn point, and I can kind of decide, I can move it around. Again, just very much like in Rhino, you can just decide, okay, I want to kind of emerge on the top of the structure, or maybe like kind of, and you can actually, I think you can actually see, it has like a big nose with a direction, so you can actually decide which way you want to turn it. So with your room, you know, you kind of want it to be in a position where you see the whole room, or you're already inside, or like right in front of the door, so somebody walks in. But this makes sense. So a person that will kind of come into the, you know, one of these avatars will be in that exact same position. So then you have light settings. So you have a directional light. You can play with that. You have a skybox. I'm not going to go through every single one of these because I want to just basically experiment a little bit with these, and like with every software, best way to learn is just to play around. So skybox essentially, you know, is sort of like a sky that allows you to decide if it's day or night and how much lighting you have. And you can also bring in additional lights here. So in elements, you can add an ambient light a directional light or so on. So for example, here, if I click on this, it appears in this list, and I see the full list of things that happens. One thing that I used in my scene that's really fun is the particle emitter. I've been, if everyone uses it, maybe it gets kind of weird, but basically it's kind of like you can just create an interactive particle emitter that just emits these cubes, and they can also, let me see if I can make it go upwards. Oh, here. So here, because it's sort of like I guess a kind of party scene, you can have it emit a lot more particles, and it can also you can give them different colors, and you can also, so here I'm just kind of like making a gradient where they're kind of like, the higher up they go, the more red they become. And what's fun is you can also give them an image. So here, instead of just using this default square, which is the white square, so in my assets from my other project, I already uploaded this circle, and I can just take it and kind of drag and drop it in here, and you see how now the image is basically replaced by my circle. And it's a fun one because you can actually import any image into here. So this is gonna look weird, but like you can actually import any image that you want. You can make it look like a soap bubble or something like that. And maybe I can make them grow. I can make the original size much smaller, and then they get bigger over time. And I kind of want them to be a little bit larger. Anyway, this is just a trick, something you can play around with. Yeah, questions?
How did you find the particle emitter?
Oh, so it's in Elements, and it's here in particle emitter.
Okay.
Another thing you can add is also you can add music. So here you can have audio. And you can actually, into the audio channel, you can load a URL. So I can go to my SoundCloud. You can have a little ambient, your own track list playing in your room. I mean, I recommend like, I'm signed out. Okay, let me. It doesn't matter. Actually, maybe I don't need to be signed in. What should we play in the room? Any suggestions? Last time you guys were complaining about my music taste, so I'm like.
Terrible.
Here, right there on the front page. They WAP in the room.
What?
Yeah, the first song, WAP by Cardi B. You can put that one.
Oh, you want Cardi B? Okay.
The real American experience.
Oh, okay, fine. All right, so let's take Cardi B and put it in here. Audio URL, so we have the SoundCloud. And now, that will be playing in our scene, for better or for worse. It was your suggestion. I'm not responsible for it.
You guys had the chance
Vika, have you heard the song?
anything about it?
No, Vika, you haven't heard the song, have you?
This is not a good song.
It's
This
literally
is not
a string of sexual.
Okay. Well, okay, one more chance. Any other suggestions?
Type in crust funk, CREST.
Crust funk.
Or with an E though, crust funk.
Crust funk.
Yeah.
You want something appropriate for, okay, this?
Oh,
No.
Wait, did somebody send me a link?
No, it's the
Ninth
wrong.
Symphony. Okay, Ninth Symphony. That is.
Yeah, sounds great. I love it.
Okay, this is appropriate. Okay, for.
I like that.
I love it.
All right, so now.
That is not what I thought would come up.
So the Ninth Symphony should be playing now. In any case, you can play around with all these different settings. I think this basic thing is, you can also, so right now I loaded the whole scene as one. There's some, if you want to get more fancy with it, you can load individual parts, and you can also play with box colliders. So if you want people to be sitting on, I don't know if it's working. When you see that sign, it's not a good sign. But in any case, maybe you have to be logged in after all. But in any case, you know, you want to at this point test your scene for sure. So you go publish to hubs. So this is where you kind of like export your scene essentially, or it's basically like saving it. Oh, one thing I should mention when you oh wait, where was it? Was this here? Oh yeah, scene preview camera. So when you want to save kind of like a scene preview, you do that here. So you just say set from viewport. So this is the current screen that you have active at the very moment is gonna be the preview camera that's gonna get saved. So that's just important when you send the links to somebody, you don't want it to look too bad. So now this is the kind of screen preview that you would be using. So right now it's called wide open space. I'm just gonna call it demo. Oh, I should have called it Ninth Symphony. Okay, maybe.
Oh, this is beautiful. I love this.
So here, save and publish, and it's exporting it. And this is actually, that model was way too heavy. And it's going to give me some warnings. So I'm basically showing you bad practices, but you'll see that it still should be possible to export it. Okay, so here I have way too many polygons. So I'm not even going to show you how this like too much, but so you know I should have optimized the scene way more. But you see you can push it a little bit.
But how come I export from Rhino and then into this one, the textures are not saved? When exporting from Rhino, the texture is not saved.
It's not saved?
It's not.
In Blender or already into?
Right now it's in the hub, in the spoke.
In spoke? Okay. Well, let's do individual text support after. But if you kept the texture in the same folder and just, if you didn't move the texture file, like generally, you know, it should actually upload it at the same time.
I'm not that fancy to change anything, trust me. So yeah. It's fine. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
That's sexy.
Yeah, you see, it's kind of too heavy. I can also upload the one actually. Yeah. Let's just wait. It's going to be done in like 30 seconds. We do need to finish soon, so we have time enough to look at your projects. But so again, this is maybe just an argument for you to not upload too heavy scenes. So if your file is more optimized, this process is going to go a lot faster. All right, so now I can go view your scene, and it's going to ask me to create a room with the scene. You just say yes, and it creates automatically this pretty ridiculous URL. So here it says adventurous profitable convention. That's just a hub thing for some reason. But that's fine. That's just I mean, oh, here it is. All right. So enter room. Okay, I'm gonna call myself Ika. Accept. Enter on screen. Enter now. All right, and remember when we picked the view? So this is exactly the view in which I appeared. Oh, you hear it?
It's cool.
Okay, I'm gonna send it to you guys so you can all. The Ninth Symphony is playing.
How do you save your view? Do you just click save or what?
All right, so I'm gonna stop screen sharing.
That was the PAL, the PAL location.
The PAL location?
You can check it out on your own. Mute yourself if you have the Beethoven, or maybe everyone should just play Beethoven together. But and you know, you'll also notice when you get the closer you get to the SoundCloud button, the louder the music will be.
That's pretty awesome, actually.
Okay, this is better than Carby.
It's in right now? The link? Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and so when you want to make changes, basically you can, oh, okay. I'm going to leave because I think it's creating weird echoes. But when you making changes in when you make changes, you can just make them in Spoke and then re-export, and it's just going to overwrite the same file. Okay, that should give you the basic tools to upload your scene. Again, if you want to get fancy with it or try other stuff, I'm definitely available the next 2 days for tech support. Just tell me. And if you have a problem with the textures, when I saw them in Rhino, it just all exported perfectly with it. But we can go over individual questions outside of class. Okay, this is it from me. I'm gonna actually